June 4, 1942. North of Midway Atoll, the Japanese carrier strike force steams through calm Pacific waters. On board the aircraft carrier Sōryū, flight deck crews work quickly among rows of aircraft being refueled and rearmed after the morning strike against the island. Shortly after 10:20 in the morning, lookouts suddenly spot aircraft high above the fleet. American dive bombers are descending toward the carriers. Within seconds, bombs begin falling across the Japanese formation. One plunges through Sōryū's flight deck and explodes deep inside the hangar. Another detonates moments later among fueled aircraft and stacked ordnance. Fire spreads rapidly through the enclosed hangars. Within minutes, Sōryū is burning from bow to stern. This is the story of Sōryū, one of Japan's prized fleet carriers, destroyed in minutes during the Battle of Midway. Sōryū was one of the Imperial Japanese Navy's early purpose-built fleet carriers, commissioned in December 1937 as Japan expanded its naval aviation program during the 1930s. Although often grouped with the carrier Hiryu, the two ships were not identical. Hiryu was built as a modified design incorporating several improvements based on concerns identified during Sōryū's construction, including adjustments to stability, internal subdivision, and opposite placement of the island superstructure, so that the pair could potentially operate closely side by side, mirroring flight patterns. Sōryū measured roughly 746 feet in length and a full load displacement of about 19,000 tons. Powered by 4 geared steam turbines, she produced around 152,000 shaft horsepower, allowing speeds of 34 knots, making her one of the fastest aircraft carriers in the world at the time of her commissioning. Speed was a key feature of Japanese carrier doctrine, allowing the ship to maneuver quickly during flight operations and operate effectively with fast-moving carrier task forces. Her flight deck extended nearly the full length of the hull and was supported above 2 enclosed hangar decks. Aircraft were moved between the hangars and the flight deck by 3 elevators positioned along the center line. This arrangement allowed deck crews to cycle aircraft rapidly during strike operations, something the Japanese Navy emphasized heavily in pre-war training. The flight deck itself was constructed primarily of wood laid over a steel framework, typical of many carriers of the era. Sōryū normally carried an air group of around 60 aircraft, though the exact composition changed throughout the war. By the time of the Battle of Midway, her air group consisted primarily of Zero fighters, Val dive bombers, and Kate torpedo bombers. These aircraft formed the core of Japan's carrier aviation strength during the early years of the Pacific War. Defensive armament consisted of 6 twin 5-inch dual-purpose guns mounted along the sides of the ship, supported by just over a dozen 25mm anti-aircraft guns for close defense against attacking aircraft. However, like many carriers built during the interwar period, Sōryū carried relatively light armor protection. Japanese naval planners prioritized speed and aircraft capacity over survivability, believing that carrier battles would be decided by striking first rather than enduring heavy damage. During design and early service, however, naval architects recognized several limitations in Sōryū's layout. Her relatively narrow beam raised concerns about stability under heavy operational loads, and the arrangement of the hangar decks and aviation fuel systems left the ship vulnerable to rapidly spreading fires if bombs penetrated the flight deck. Despite these vulnerabilities, Sōryū represented one of the most capable carriers in the Imperial Japanese Navy when she entered service. By the start of the Pacific War, she was part of the elite First Air Fleet, the powerful carrier striking force that would spearhead Japan's early offensive across the Pacific. Commissioned in December 1937, Sōryū spent her early years in fleet exercises and patrols. By 1941, she formed the 2nd Carrier Division alongside sister Hiryu in Nagumo's First Air Fleet. Through 1941 and early 1942, she took part in Japan's major offensives. On December 7, 1941, 6 of her Kate torpedo bombers helped sink the USS Utah at Pearl Harbor and hit the cruiser Raleigh, though 2 of Sōryū's planes were lost. Soon after Pearl Harbor, Sōryū supported the capture of Wake Island on December 23 to 24, 1941, launching dive bombers against the defenders. In early 1942, she steamed with Nagumo's fleet into the Dutch East Indies. Her planes struck Allied positions during the invasions of Rabaul and the Davao Gulf, and in January supported landings in Ambon and Borneo. On the 19th of February 1942, her dive bombers and torpedo planes raided Darwin, Australia, destroying several transport ships and air installations. In late March 1942, Sōryū joined the Indian Ocean raid. Together with Akagi, Kaga and Hiryu, she struck British bases and shipping in Ceylon, contributing to the sinking of HMS Cornwall and Dorsetshire on April 5, 1942. After the Indian raid, Sōryū steamed via Truk to Japan, arriving at Hashirajima on April 22nd. There she was, refueled and rearmed with fresh bombs and torpedoes. No major repairs were needed. Her crew instead trained intensively in night deck landing and damage control drills during May. Some additional 25mm AA guns and a Type 21 radar were reportedly fitted. By May 25th, she had her full complement of aircraft and was declared combat ready. That day, Sōryū departed Japan for the Northwest Pacific, alongside the carriers Akagi, Kaga, and Hiryu, carrying her seasoned air group to the upcoming Midway operation. At dawn on June 4, 1942, Nagumo's carrier force lay roughly 250 nautical miles northwest of Midway Atoll. The fleet zigzagged by day and zigzagged by night to avoid submarine attack. On board Sōryū, crews stood by at battle stations. Sōryū launched her primary strike against Midway. 18 Nakajima B-5 N-Kate torpedo bombers roared down the flight deck under the command of Lieutenant Kakuichi Takahashi, escorted by 9 A-6 M20s. They headed toward Midway's eastern island to attack fuel dumps and aircraft. Meanwhile, Sōryū's fighters strafed the field. The strike drew heavy flak, but they pressed on and then returned to Sōryū by about 7:15. Sōryū's crew counted the losses. 1 Kate had been shot down over Midway, 2 more had ditched in the lagoon, crews later recovered by float planes, and 5 other planes were so damaged they would never fly again. All surviving planes landed on deck by 7:15. Sōryū promptly refueled and rearmed her returning Zeros, turning about to face the gathering threats of the day. Between 7:30 and 9 o'clock, the fleet recovered returning planes and made final preparations. At about 8 o'clock, an American B-17 Flying Fortress high-altitude bomber attacked the carriers. Sōryū's captains, expecting such strikes, had formed their anti-aircraft circles. Sōryū herself executed a tight turn to evade the bombing run. A photo later showed her circling a smoke column in the lagoon, and all bombs dropped by the B-17 fell wide into the water. By 8:30, the air groups were refueled and ready, and the fighters resumed patrol in the air above the carriers. At 9:18, the first of the American carrier strike waves arrived. 15 Douglas TBD-1 Devastator torpedo planes of Torpedo Squadron 8 from USS Hornet came in at mast top level. Sōryū had 6 Zero fighters aloft on combat air patrol, and Akagi and Hiryu also each had lights airborne. The Japanese fighters swarmed the torpedo bombers. In seconds, every one of the 15 Devastators was shot down. The torpedoes dropped all ran harmlessly wide of the carriers. Only 1 pilot of VT-8 survived to report the attack. Sōryū herself took evasive maneuvers during the assault, but suffered no hits. The Americans persisted. At 9:50, a formation of 14 TBD Devastators from Torpedo Squadron 6, Enterprise, dove toward Sōryū and her sisters. Sōryū launched 3 fresh Zeros at 0945 to augment the cap. These Zeros clashed with the incoming planes, just as flak barrages erupted from the carriers. Again, the torpedo planes were decimated. Only about 4 planes of VT-6 got into attack position, and none of their torpedoes found a target. Soon after, 12 TBD Devastators from Torpedo Squadron 3, Yorktown, pressed home a 3rd torpedo attack. Sōryū scrambled 3 more Zeros at 0957 to defend. The defenders again cut down the attackers. Only a few Devastators survived the second wave, and none hit Sōryū. By 10:15, all of Sōryū's fighters had landed to refuel, and none remained on cap. For a moment, it seemed the torpedo strikes had been repelled without critical damage. Destroyers Isozake and Hamikaze recovered dozens of aircrew, tossing ropes to pilots and gunners pulled from the water. But then came the decisive blow. Dauntless dive bombers from VB-3 aboard USS Yorktown arrived over the Japanese fleet. The American scout planes had pinpointed the carrier's position and vectored the dive bombers in. By this time, Sōryū was flying no cap fighters. Her Zeros and ammo were on deck from the morning's fighting. The Dauntlesses approached high and cast off at altitude. The first bombs fell on Akagi, but the next wave targeted Sōryū. At 10:25, 3 1,000-pound bombs struck Sōryū's deck in quick succession. The first hit amidships and penetrated the armoured hangar deck. It smashed into the lower hangar, puncturing the fuel tanks and detonating stored depth charges and munitions. The second and third bombs struck the forward and aft sections of the upper hangar respectively. At that moment, both hangars were packed with aircraft ready for rearmament. The effects were instantaneous and catastrophic. Gasoline tanks and oil barrels ignited, and bombs and torpedoes on the hangar deck exploded in rapid succession. A massive fireball leaped out of the flight deck and framed the carrier in an orange glow. Within seconds, Sōryū was a blazing inferno. The forward funnel and signal mast were knocked down by concussive force. Steam lines and cables were severed. Fires engulfed the island. Superheated gases cracked metal across the ship. Sōryū lurched to starboard under the blast, then listed as weight shifted upward into the flames. Damage control parties sprang into action, but every measure failed against the damage. Crewmen flooded nearby compartments to stabilize the list. Others shouted orders to close bulkheads and vent smoke. But with fires in both hangars, each new explosion hurled debris that ignited more fires. In one deck after the other, control stations lost power. By 10:40, Sōryū had lost all steam pressure and electrical power. The engines were dead. Black smoke and flame boiled from her funnel and flight deck. For 20 minutes, Sōryū burned out of control. Captain Yanagimoto remained on the blazing bridge, directing evacuation teams. The island had become untenable, with flames beneath it. At about 10:45, Yanagimoto gave the order, "Abandon ship." Lifeboats and life rafts were launched over the sides. Crewmen, many wounded or burned, jumped into the oily water and swam clear. Destroyers Isozake and Hamikaze came alongside, shooting lines over to survivors and hauling them aboard. Crew on deck wrapped their lifebelts under injured men and hoisted them over the rails. By dusk, hundreds were rescued. Some bodies floated or were found clinging to rafts. Even after being abandoned, Sōryū remained afloat as a raging hulk. Flames still roared in her aft hangar, visible many miles away. Only once night fell was Sōryū finally dispatched. Isokaze moved in and fired a pair of torpedoes into the blazing carrier's hull. With a shudder and muffled explosion, Sōryū sank beneath the waves, behind a cloud of black smoke. In total, of her crew of around 1,100 officers and men, 711 were lost with Sōryū. Many burned when the hangars erupted, and many drowned or were scalded by escaping steam. Captain Yanagimoto went down with the ship, along with most of his bridge team. Only about 400 survivors were saved, many suffering severe injuries. One of the ship's deck officers later recalled the scene in the water as utter chaos, bodies and life vests everywhere, all lit by the fires we had just left. The sinking of Sōryū, together with Akagi, Kaga and Hiryu that same morning, meant disaster for Japan's carrier fleet. Almost 2/3 of the core carriers of the combined fleet were destroyed in one day. Nagumo's strike force was crippled and forced to withdraw. The planned Midway invasion was cancelled on the spot. In effect, Japan's bid for Pacific dominance had been broken. Japan lost 4 carriers and hundreds of trained pilots. The immediate consequences were profound. The Pacific strategic initiative shifted to the Allies. The removal of Sōryū and her sister carriers allowed US forces to advance in the Solomon Islands and New Guinea without facing equivalent carrier threats. Tokyo was forced onto the defensive. In Japanese naval circles, Sōryū's loss highlighted critical design lessons. All 4 carriers lost at Midway succumbed to raging fires fueled by aviation gasoline and bombs on their hangars. In the months after Midway, the IJN spread its carriers into smaller groups and emphasized damage control, hoping to prevent a repeat. But the blow was irreversible. By late 1942, the US had more carriers in service than Japan. In all, the fate of Sōryū on June 4, 1942, was a turning point. Her destruction, emblematic of the overall outcome of the Battle of Midway, halted Japanese expansion and marked the shift of naval supremacy in the Pacific. The ship and her men earned no glory at the end, but their story underscores the brutal reality of carrier warfare and the high price of strategic surprise.